What up, what up? Welcome back to the channel, and thank you all for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and like the video if you like the video. As always, we're playing with some cool people, so a big thanks to Cypher, Cliff, and Will for letting me record this game of Commander. Now, let's get on into these opening hands. I'll be playing Myrkul, Lord of Bones, with a focus on aristocrats. My starting 7 is going to have a Marsh Flats, a Swords to Plowshares, a Vault of Champions, a Swamp, an Archon of Sun's Grace, a Deathrite Shaman, and a Devoted Druid. Cypher's going to be playing his Syrix, Carrier of the Flame, Phoenix Tribal deck. His starting 7 is going to have a Commander Sphere, an High Market, a Taurian Mauler, a Swamp, a Blightstep Pathway, an Akum Firebird, and a Blood Crypt. Cliff is playing his Wilhelt Zombie Tribal deck. His starting 7 has 2 islands, a Drowned Catacomb, a Witch's Cottage, a Tainted Isle, a Necro Duality, and an Headless Rider. Will is playing Sheoldred Graveyard Matters, and his starting 7 has an Urborg, a Solemn Simulacrum, a Damnation, a Buried Alive, a Marsh Flats, a Mana Crypt, and a Crucible of Worlds. I'll start by playing a Swamp, then I'll cast Deathrite Shaman. It can be tapped to exile a land from a graveyard for 1 mana. For a black and a tap, it can exile an instant from a graveyard to drain each opponent for 2. For a green and a tap, it can exile a creature card to gain 2 life. I'll pass turn after that. Cypher plays a Blood Crypt tapped and pass. Cliff plays a Tainted Isle and pass. Will plays an Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth, making every land a swamp. He'll pass after that. I'll play a Marsh Flats, I'll crack it to fetch an Endatha Triome, and I'll pass the turn. Cypher plays a High Market and pass to Cliff, who just plays an island and passes. Will plays a Marsh Flats, then he casts Mana Crypt. He'll use that mana to cast the sad robot Solemn Simulacrum, fetching up a swamp with his trigger. I'll play the Vault of Champions, then I'll exile my own Marsh Flats to my Shaman for 1 mana, which I'll use to cast an Archon of Sun's Grace. It gives all of my Pegasus creatures lifelink, and whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield under my control, I create a 2/2 white Pegasus creature token with flying. I'll ship the turn over to Cypher. Cypher plays a Luxury Suite, then he'll cast Taurian Mauler. It's a changeling that gets a +1/+1 counter on it whenever an opponent casts a spell. That's all he's going to do from there. Cliff plays an island. After that, he casts Headless Rider, triggering the Taurian Mauler to get a counter. Headless Rider allows Cliff to create a 2/2 zombie whenever it or another non-token zombie he controls dies. He'll pass to Will after that. Will starts by rolling for his Mana Crypt trigger. He wins, so he doesn't take any damage. Then he casts Buried Alive, triggering the Mauler. He'll put 3 creatures into his graveyard: Runescarred Demon, Bloodghast, and Villis Broker of Blood. He plays a Swamp, triggering Bloodghast landfall ability, so he'll put that onto the battlefield and pass the turn to me. I'll play Reflecting Pool, then I'll tap completely out to cast Smothering Tide. Time for people to pay their taxes. This triggers Archon of Sun's Grace, so I'll get a Pegasus token. I'll move to combat and send my Archon at Will. Will takes the damage and I'll gain 3 life and pass the turn. Cypher doesn't pay his taxes, so I'll get a treasure. Cypher plays a mountain and then he'll cast Akum Firebird. It has haste, it has to attack each turn, and it has the landfall ability to allow Cypher to pay 6 mana to return it from the graveyard to the battlefield. He sends both attacks at Will, who blocks the Mauler with Sad Robot, and he'll take 3 in the air. Will draws because Solemn died. He pays his taxes for that draw, and Cypher passes the turn. Cliff pays his taxes, then he'll play a Drowned Catacomb, which he'll use to cast Arcane Signet. Mauler triggers, so it'll get a counter, and Cliff passes the turn. Will doesn't pay his taxes. He loses his Mana Crypt roll this time. With the board slowly getting out of control, he casts Damnation to destroy all creatures. I respond to that by sacrificing a treasure and tapping Deathrite Shaman to exile the Rune-Scarred Demon in Will's graveyard. Damnation resolves and all creatures are wiped. Cliff has a death trigger to create a zombie from Headless Rider. Will plays a Gaia Reach Sanitarium and uses it to cast Necropotence. Necropotence skips his draw step, and any card he discards is exiled. He can pay 1 life to exile a card face down, then at his end step, put the exiled cards into his hand. It turns his life into card draw, and this is problematic. He'll pay 4 life to exile 4 cards that he can put to his hand at his end step. He'll pass it to me from there. Sadly, I'll miss my land drop. Then I'll tap out and sacrifice my treasure to cast Moldervine Reclamation. Whenever a creature I control dies, I gain a life and draw a card. I'll give the turn to Cypher from there. Cypher doesn't pay his taxes. He'll play Seer Step Pathway as his land for turn. Then he'll cast his commander, Syrix, Carrier of the Flame. Of course it has flying and haste, and at the beginning of each end step, if a creature card left his graveyard this turn, target Phoenix he controls deals damage equal to its power to any target. And whenever another Phoenix he controls dies, he can cast his commander from the graveyard. He moves to combat and sends the 3/3 at will with no blocks. Cliff pays his taxes, then he'll play a swamp. He'll tap for 4 to cast Necro Duality, so whenever he gets a non-token zombie, he gets to create a token that's a copy of that zombie. He'll move to combat, attacking Will with his 2/2 zombie for no blocks before passing the turn. Will loses his mana crypt roll, taking 3 damage. He plays a swamp, triggering Bloodghast. Then he'll cast his very scary commander, Sheoldred Whispering One. Makes an appearance. She has Swamp Walk. At the beginning of his upkeep, he returns a creature card from his graveyard to the battlefield. While at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, they have to sacrifice a creature. He'll pay 2 life to exile 2 cards to Necropotence. He discards a swamp from his hand to exile and pass the turn. I'm gonna start my main phase by casting Yawgmoth, Grand Physician. I can pay 1 life and sacrifice a creature to put a -1/-1 counter on a creature while also drawing a card. I can also pay 2 black mana and discard a card to proliferate. I'll play a Plains, and with nothing left to do, I'll pass the turn. Because of Sheoldred, Cypher is forced to sacrifice his commander. He chooses not to pay his taxes. He'll play a Mountain, and then tap out to cast Akum Firebird thanks to his landfall ability. He moves to combat and sends it at will for 3 in the air and pass the turn. Cliff is going to sacrifice his zombie token to the Sheoldred. He doesn't pay his taxes this time around. He'll play Witch's Cottage, allowing him to put his Headless Rider on top of his library. From there, he'll cast his commander, Wilhelt the Rock Cleaver. Whenever another zombie he controls dies, if it didn't have Decayed, he creates a 2/2 zombie with Decayed. He can also sacrifice a zombie to draw a card at his end step. Because of Necroduality, he'll get another Wilhelt that will die to the Legend rule. Because it didn't have Decayed, he'll get a 2/2. Then he'll cast Lord of the Undead to give his other zombies +1/+1. He can also pay 2 and tap it to return a zombie from his graveyard to his hand. He'll get 2 of those thanks to Necroduality. He'll sacrifice his Decayed zombie to draw a card at his end step, not paying his taxes. At Cliff's end step, I'm gonna cast Swords to Plowshares targeting Will's commander. She'll get exiled and he'll gain 6 life. Will wins his mana crypt roll. Then he'll start his main phase by casting Junji the Midnight Sky. When Junji dies, Will can have each opponent discard 2 cards and lose 2 life, or he can put a non-dragon creature from any graveyard onto the battlefield under his control at the cost of 2 life. Then he'll cast Dalthy Voidwalker, which is a shadow that exiles all cards put into the graveyard with void counters. He can tap and sacrifice Dauthi to play any exile card with the void counter on it. More importantly, it turns off all graveyards in a pod full of graveyard decks. He moves to combat and sends his Bloodghast at Cypher for 2 damage before passing the turn. I'm gonna tap 5 and sacrifice a treasure to cast Requiem Angel. It's one of the best aristocrat pieces in my deck. Whenever another non-spirit creature I control dies, I put a 1/1 white spirit creature token with flying onto the battlefield. I'll move to combat and send my Yawgmoth at Cypher for 2 damage and pass the turn. Cypher again doesn't pay his taxes. He'll cast Lightning Phoenix, which is a 2/2 hasty boy that can't block. At the beginning of his end step, if an opponent was dealt 3 or more damage this turn, he can pay 1 red mana to return it from the graveyard to the battlefield. He moves to combat, sending the 5 damage in the air at Will, who doesn't block. Then he'll cast a Commander Sphere and pass the turn. Cliff doesn't pay his taxes, so I'll get to make a treasure later. He'll cast an Ashnod's Altar, then he'll sacrifice his Zombie Lord token to the altar for 2 mana, creating a Decayed Zombie. He'll sacrifice the Decayed Zombie to the altar for another 2 mana. Then he'll tap 2 black to cast another Damnation to destroy all creatures. I respond to that by sacrificing 3 treasures and casting Teferi's Protection. All of my permanents phase out, the board gets wiped, Junji triggers, so Will gets to return a non-dragon creature from his graveyard to the battlefield at the cost of 2 life. He chooses to bring back Villas, Broker of Blood, from the graveyard. Cliff casts Headless Rider, getting a copy. Then he'll cast Gravecrawler, getting another copy before passing the turn. Will loses his mana crypt roll, going down to 10 life. Because of Villas, he'll draw 3 cards from losing those 3 life. Because whenever he loses life, he gets to draw that many cards. He'll play a Nykthos, Shrine to Nyx, triggering Bloodghast landfall ability again. He'll tap Nykthos for 7 black mana, using 5 of it to cast Gilded Lotus. After that, he'll recast his commander, Sheoldred Whispering One. He passes the turn to me. I phase back in just in time to have to sacrifice my Yawgmoth to Sheoldred's ability. I'll create a 1/1 Flying Spirit. I gain a life and draw a card whenever my creature dies thanks to Moldavine Reclamation. I'll play a Phyrexian Tower as my land for turn, using its ability to sacrifice my spirit token for 2 black mana, which I'll use to cast my commander, Myrkul, Lord of Bones. Whenever another non-token creature I control dies, I can exile it. If I do, I create a token that's a copy of the creature except it's an enchantment and loses all of its other typings. Because the spirit died, I'll draw a card and gain a life. I'll sacrifice my last 2 treasures to cast Devoted Druid. With Devoted Druid on the stack, Will casts Tragic Slip, giving Myrkul -13/-13, killing it. I'll make another spirit, draw a card, and gain a life when Myrkul dies. I'll move to combat and send my 5/5 Angel at Cliff for 5 damage in the air before moving to my end step where Cypher sacrifices Commander Sphere to draw himself a card. Cypher doesn't pay his taxes, so I get a treasure token from the Commander Sphere and a treasure from the card draw for his turn. He'll cast Jeska's Will, targeting Will to float 5 red mana, which he'll use to cast Shard Phoenix. Then he sacrifices Shard Phoenix to deal 2 damage to each creature without flying. That kills my Devoted Druid and wipes Cliff's board, leaving him with 2 Decayed Zombies. I'll draw a card and gain a life. Because the Phoenix died, Cypher casts his commander, Syrix, from the graveyard. At the beginning of his end step, because a creature left his graveyard this turn, he targets his commander to deal damage equal to its power to Will. Will takes the 3 damage and draws 3 cards, only being able to pay his taxes on one of them, so I'll make 2 treasures. Cliff pays his taxes by sacrificing a zombie to the altar, creating 2 mana. Because he controls a zombie, he casts Gravecrawler from his graveyard, getting a copy. He sacrifices the Gravecrawler for 2 mana. Then he casts the Gravecrawler again, getting another copy. He'll sacrifice the Gravecrawler another time, recasting it and getting another copy. Then he sacrifices one of his tokens and casts his commander, Wilhelt, getting a copy that dies to the legend rule, leaving behind a decayed zombie. He'll sacrifice another non-decayed zombie and cast a Poppet Stitcher, which will have Wilhelt creating another decayed zombie. He'll move to his end step and sacrifice a non-decayed zombie to draw himself a card with Wilhelt's ability, not paying his taxes. During his end step, I'll cast Assassin's Trophy targeting Will's Sheoldred before he gets to reanimate anything. With the swamp he gets from Assassin's Trophy, Will casts Entomb, putting Grey Merchant of Asphodel into his graveyard. Will starts his turn by losing his mana crypt roll and taking 3 damage. Villas will have him drawing 3 cards. He doesn't pay his taxes on any of them this time. He plays a swamp. Then he casts Dark Ritual. He'll use that mana to tap Nykthos, floating 7 mana. He'll tap completely out to cast Torment of Hellfire, where X equals 19. Cliff responds to that on the stack by sacrificing a token and casting Lazotep Plating. It gives him a zombie army creature along with making him and all of his permanents hexproof. Torment of Hellfire resolves, and I sacrifice enough permanents, leaving myself with 5 life and a spirit token to block Villas, along with 5 treasures. I'll draw a card and gain a life for each of my creatures that died. Cypher doesn't have enough permanents or life, so he's out of the game. Cliff sacrifices enough permanents, leaving him with 2 life. Will moves to combat and sends Velas at Cliff, taking him out of the game and passing the turn over to me. I'll cast Eviscera Seer, which lets me sacrifice any creature to scry 1 card. Then I'll cast Cruel Celebrant. Whenever Cruel Celebrant or another creature I control dies, each opponent loses 1 life and I gain 1 life. After that, I'll cast Guardian Augmenter, which gives my commander +2/+2 and hexproof, but right now, it's just a good body to sacrifice. I'll move to combat, sending my 1/1 Flying Spirit at will for 1 damage. I'll then sacrifice the spirit to drain Will for 1. Then I'll sacrifice the Guardian Augmenter to drain for another 1. All that's left for me to do is sacrifice Viscera Seer to take Will out of the game. That'll give me the win this week. Thanks for sticking around. Hope you all enjoyed the gameplay, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Until next time, I'll see you at the table.